All right, welcome back, critical thinkers. Today we're going to talk about other basic psychological processes that interfere with our ability to make good rational decisions. And today we're going to be talking about social influence. Really the idea that other people can sometimes influence us so that we don't make good, accurate decisions about ourselves and about our lives. And today we're going to be focusing on conformity. And something to keep in mind about sort of our discussion, our last two discussions in regards to psychological processes. Today we're going to be talking about conformity, and next time we're going to be talking about obedience. And these are just basic psychological tendencies we all have. But keep in mind that neither one is necessarily bad, right? Our tendency to conform and our tendency to obey people in authority are not necessarily a bad thing, but they can be. They can interfere with our ability to make good rational decisions, which is why it's important for a critical thinker to recognize this tendency we all have to conform or obey, so that when you're in a situation where conformity may lead you to make a bad decision, you can push back against that. All right, so make sure you have the slides labeled conformity. The first slide says fair-minded. Guess what? We could be wrong, meaning collectively as a group, people can be wrong and thus make bad decisions. All right, slide 2. What is social influence, first of all? First, we need a sort of a basic working definition of what social influence is. And social influence is defined as the effect that real or imagined people have on our beliefs and our behavior, right? The idea that we change our beliefs or we might change our behavior because of other people is the definition of social influence. And what do I mean by imagined people? I don't mean like, Puff the Magic Dragon type of imagination. What I'm talking about here is people can influence our decisions even when they're not in the room currently. Like, for example, right now, you all are influencing me even though I'm not actually in the room with you. Right? And when you go to then study for the exam, right? You may study for the exam in a particular way because you're imagining how I might evaluate your subsequent exam performance, right? So that's the effect of imagining me on your behavior, right? Right. So social influence. We are going to focus on 3 types of social influence as very common barriers to making good critical thinking based decisions. And the first thing we're doing is we're going to focus on conformity and compliance. Those are the things we're going to talk about today. So what is conformity? Slide 3. Conformity is the tendency to match, to conform, to look at what other people are doing and to match our behavior or our beliefs to those behaviors or beliefs that we see in other people. It's a tendency to match others. That's the definition of conformity. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. And there's different types of conformity that we're going to explore. But that is what conformity is, the matching tendency. You're doing something, so I do that same thing. You believe something, so I believe that same thing. Conformity. Slide 4. Compliance, on the other hand, is when we change our behavior because someone wants us to change our behavior. Conformity is different, right? We may conform to other people's beliefs whether or not they want us to believe what they believe, right? Or we may do what other people are doing, whether or not they even notice that we're going to do what they're doing, right? Conformity can happen with or without the other person's knowledge or intention. Compliance is different. Compliance is where we change our behavior or we change our beliefs because somebody else wants us to. They're intentionally trying to influence us. They may do this directly by saying, hey, I want you to do this, or hey, I want to try to convince you to believe what I believe. Or they can be more subtle about it. They can be more manipulative about it. Like, think salesmen, right? When salesmen try to subtly get you to buy things, they may subtly try to get you to comply with what they want, right? And we call that then compliance, when it's when the person wants you to change your beliefs or behavior, and then you do. The last one on slide 5 is obedience, and this is a special type of compliance. This is the type of compliance where you change your beliefs or behavior because someone in power, someone in authority wants you to change your beliefs or behavior. Then we call that type of compliance obedience. Today we'll talk about conformity and compliance. But first, I just want to very briefly talk about sort of why we do these things, right? Sort of a little bit of the research on why we have a tendency to comply, and why we have the tendency to conform, and why we have a tendency to obey, because they're not necessarily bad. They're really not, right? The tendency we have as the human species to do what other people are doing, conformity, and the tendency we all have as the human species to comply and to obey, they're not necessarily bad things. They're adaptive. They help us move through the world. And so, just real briefly, let's talk about people's motives. And what the research indicates people's broad motives are in the world. And this is different than like our needs, like our safety needs. This is what psychological research indicates motivates us, where we think to ourselves, why did someone do this? We can sort of identifying their underlying motive. And of course, there are a million different motives, right? Like, I work out because I want to feel healthy. That's a motive. But if you look at all the types of motives that human beings have, they really fall into three broad camps. They fall into the need to belong. Human beings, being a social species, seem to have an intrinsic, evolutionarily, biologically hardwired drive to feel as though they belong to a group or people beyond themselves. We want other people to like us. So compliance and conformity may lead other people to like us, right? We may conform to get other people to like us because this is just a basic innate tendency we have as people. The second motive is the need to just achieve our goals, what are called our instrumental goals, right? So the real world, I could touch it. Instrumental goals. That's what it means to say instrumental. It means tangible goals, right? So we may conform because we don't want other people to get in the way of what we want to do, right? Because let's say I want to get a raise. That's an instrumental goal, right? And so I may always agree with my boss. I may conform with what my boss thinks is true about the world, so he doesn't or she doesn't get in the way of what I want. So that's the idea. That's another motive behind conformity, compliance, and obedience. Right? And the last is a need to understand. We're rational creatures, right? Human beings have large forebrains, large prefrontal cortices, right? The critical thinking part of your brain is right up here, right? And we have just an innate motive to want to understand the world accurately. And we may see other people as legitimate sources of information. And we may change our beliefs and change our attitudes in order to, because we really believe that other people have good information. And we have a powerful need to understand our world so we can move in our world in a predictable way and feel confident in that our actions are going to lead to the outcomes we want. We have a need to understand. And all of these are sort of the underlying reasons why people conform and comply and obey. It's not bad. It's adaptive. It just can sometimes, these motives can sometimes betray us and lead us to make bad decisions. So, slide 7, conformity. To remind you, it is the basic tendency to match our behaviors or our beliefs to somebody else's, right? But remember, this is in service of those motives, right? We're not doing it because we're sheep. People don't conform because they're stupid. People conform because they're trying to get along with other people, they're trying to get the things they want, and because they're trying to understand the world. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. Also recognize that conformity comes in a lot of different varieties. Now, I think the stereotypical vision of conformity is that everybody's doing something, the majority of people are doing something, and so then I conform. But that doesn't always have to be the case. Sometimes we conform to one other person, right? One other person is doing something, and it looks like the right thing to do, so we do what they do as well. Conformity, right? Think about leadership. When there's a strong, powerful leader, and then we conform with that one person, that is an aspect of conformity. So you don't always have to be conforming to groups. You can conform to one other person, and it's still conformity. Or social influence, I guess, is the less stigmatized way of describing conformity, right? Social influence is a little less judgmental, but still, researchers describe this as conformity, right? Conformity, social influence is the same thing. Also recognize that even if you are conforming to a group, you can conform to what the majority of people are doing, or you can conform to what a minority of people are doing. And sort of think about like subcultures within a larger community. I like to think back to high school, where there were lots of different sort of cliques. There were when I was in high school, there were like, goth kids, and there were cheerleaders, and there were drama people, and there were band people, and they all had these little sort of subcultures where people dressed sort of the same, and people sort of acted sort of the same, and did all the same sorts of things. And so even if you were a smaller clique at the school, like the goth kids, those goth kids were very much conforming with each other, right? And this is still social influence, even though they're conforming to a sort of a minority opinion. It's still conformity, it's still social influence. And then more importantly, I think it's important to recognize that there are two very different styles of conformity. There is the type of conformity where the type of social influence where people actually come to privately accept the other person's point of view, come to privately accept that the other person's behavior is in fact the right way to behave. This is called private acceptance. And this type of conformity is called informational social influence. You're looking to other people to influence you because you want good information. And so we'll explore that type of social influence first. But then there's also something called simply public acquiescence. Acquiescence there is a fancy $3 word. And it simply means to give in, to acquiesce, to engage in acquiescence, is to give in. And this is a very different type of conformity. This is a very different type of social influence. Public acquiescence is referred to as normative social influence. And this type of conformity is really being driven by and motivated by a person's desire to simply not be ridiculed, to simply not be rejected. There's no true conversion, right? The person doesn't actually think that the other person's point of view is correct. This person doesn't actually think that the other person's behavior is correct. They're just doing it to look normal, which is why it's called normative social influence. And there's different there's different things that predict these different types of social influence, different motives that underlie these different social influences, and different effects that come from these two different types of social influence. And neither one is good and neither one is bad necessarily. In fact, both can lead one to make good decisions, and both can lead one to make bad decisions, right? Neither one is necessarily good or bad. They're just two different varieties. So the first thing I want to have you guys do is I want you guys to watch this YouTube clip. This is called The Smoke-Filled Room. There's no words, so it doesn't need to be captioned or anything for those that may be relevant for. So just watch it, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about it. So go ahead and do that. So what are we seeing here? What are we seeing in this video? So in this video, we see a woman who is by herself, right? And when she's by herself, it takes a second for her to go get help when smoke starts to fill the room. But then when the next participant comes in and and this person is in the room with what are called Confederates. Now, this has nothing to do with the Civil War. A Confederate in research is someone who is in on it. That's what we mean by Confederate. They're an accomplice. But we don't use the word accomplice because that suggests a crime. But a Confederate simply means someone who is aware that this study is fake, and they've been trained to have a particular response. So that's called the Confederate. So this second participant is in the room with a bunch of Confederates who have been trained to not get up. So what happens? Well, what happens is the woman starts to think to herself, well, maybe this isn't an emergency. Well, even though smoke is pouring into this room, maybe this isn't actually an emergency. Crap, I'll just sit here, and I'll just sit here. And I'll just sit here, and I'll just sit here, and I'll just sit here, and I'll just keep sitting here forever until like the building burns down, right? This is something called the bystander effect and diffusion of responsibility. The more people who are around when some sort of dangerous event happens, and actually the less likely it is that any of those people are going to do anything to intervene or to go get help, because people have a need to understand. And if the situation is in any way ambiguous, now what does that word mean in this context? If this situation is in any way unclear, people sometimes find themselves paralyzed when other people are around. And when they're by themselves, this doesn't seem to happen, right? In these unclear situations, and when people are by themselves, they err on the side of going to get help. They err on the side of doing something. But when people are with others and the situation is at all unclear, what ends up happening is that people start looking around like this, and they don't even realize they're doing it. They're sort of unconsciously looking around like this and going, well, nobody else is moving. Maybe it's not an emergency. Or nobody else is doing anything. Maybe I don't understand what's going on here. Well, they're not doing anything. Maybe I shouldn't be doing anything. Maybe if I do something, that'll be the wrong decision. And then what they don't realize in real world situations is that everyone else is doing that same thing, right? Everyone else is going, well, that girl's not moving. And then that third person's like, well, that girl's not moving, and that guy's not moving, and well, no one's moving. Maybe I shouldn't move either. And so then everyone doesn't move, and everyone doesn't help, and everyone doesn't intervene. And this is called pluralistic influence. It's like the responsibility to do something gets diffused to too many people. And so nobody then feels enough pressure to take personal responsibility for what's happening. And so nobody does anything because they've convinced themselves that doing nothing is the right thing to do. And it's a problem if people really need help, right? And as we look at this video in this smoke-filled room study, it becomes very difficult to recognize that these type of effects would happen to us, right? We look at the woman in the video, the second woman, and think, well, I would never do that. But the research is pretty clear that almost everyone just sits there, right? Almost everyone just sits there because in that situation, there's this basic sort of evolved tendency we have to look at what other people are doing and do what they do. Because in lots of situations, doing what other people are doing is the adaptive response. Because you think that other people have good information. Let me give you an example of when informational social influence would be a good thing. So let's say you're walking on the street, and let's say you're texting on the phone, and you're walking in a group of people, and everybody stops, and you stop too. You don't know why you stopped, but everyone else is stopping, so you're stopping too. Good conformist that you are. And suddenly a bus goes whooshing by because you didn't realize you were at the curb. This is informational social influence, conformity, saving your life. But we have to recognize that in some situations, that adaptive, evolved trait that we have as a social species can sometimes betray us, as it does in the smoke-filled room study, and as it has in other sort of moments in many moments in our lives. We can end up in situations where we conform because we really think what other people are doing is the right thing, and they're wrong, right? And they're wrong. What other people are doing is actually not the right thing, right? And so keep in mind that informational social influence, this smoke-filled room study, is all about accuracy. You're really interested in making a good decision. You're privately, so we're on slide 9 now, sorry. It's really all about privately accepting, truly converting to other people's points of view, right? When that woman sits there in the smoke-filled room study, she really believes that not getting up is the right decision. She really believes that that's the good thing to do because that's what everyone around her is doing. And informational social influence, this idea that we change our behavior or our beliefs because we really think that other people have good information, is most likely to happen in situations that are unclear. So ambiguous is the word for that. Unclear. When doing the right thing is important, right? So in situations where we care about our behavior, and other people, we see them as good, accurate sources of information. If these three things are true, people are highly likely to conform to other people's points of view. And so moving on to slide 10, where this becomes so dangerous when sort of not carefully reflecting on how we may be influenced informationally by other people, a really tragic example of how this can break down on us and sort of not be a good source of information and sort of can get in the way of good critical thinking is the case of Catherine Kitty Genovese in the 1960s. Now, there's some controversy around this example, and it's taught in social psychology classes and in intro to psych classes and in critical thinking classes. But you should be aware that the actual events of that night are up for debate. Right? But here is how it was originally reported in the 1960s, right? So I'm going to share with you how it was originally reported in the 1960s. Be aware that there's debate about what actually happened, but here's how it was originally reported. In the middle of the night, a woman was murdered over the course of 45 minutes in the alley next to her apartment. Now, that is in fact true. There's no debate about that. And in fact, the man went away and came back more than once as he was assaulting and killing her. And a large number of people reported being aware of the event afterwards, right? Almost everyone in her apartment, this was a loud murder. Most of the people in her apartment, in fact, reported that they knew that something was going on outside. And that, in fact, is well documented and true. One or two people called the police. There's some conflicting reports about this, but they reported a loud argument. They didn't report that a murder was taking place. Now, at the time, it was reported that people knew she was getting murdered and did nothing. More modern accounts look back at sort of the history and the interviews and say, well, people knew something was happening, but maybe didn't know that she was getting murdered, right? They heard a loud argument, they heard a woman screaming, but nobody went outside to intervene. Nobody went outside to help. Nobody went outside to try to break up the argument or try to provide assistance. And why is that? Why did no one go outside to help? Well, we might argue that for many of these people, they may have been afraid for their own safety, but this was a crowded apartment building. Theoretically, if you think that if a crime is being committed outside, and at least you should have called the cops, the police, and only one or two people did. Or if you know that everyone is listening to this, maybe you get several people together to go see what's going on, to try to offer assistance. And yet nobody did that. Not a single person went outside to offer assistance. There's many documented cases of crimes happening in a crowd of people. people where nobody does anything. There was another case of a woman who was murdered on a bridge by her significant other in front of 30 witnesses, and nobody intervened. And so why is this? Moving on to slide 11, is this because people are bad? Is this because people in New York are callous? Is this because people don't care? And what the research suggests is absolutely not. In fact, if one person had witnessed her or heard her, like let's say she lived in like a suburban housing tract, and she lived in a cul-de-sac where only one house was directly next to hers. The research is clear that if one person had heard this altercation, and that one person knew they were the only one to hear this loud argument, that person would have almost certainly called the police, and this one person had a much higher likelihood of going out to help. It's something about knowing that lots of people are hearing the fight, lots of people are hearing this possible crime because she's screaming for help, and nobody is going out to help. That becomes this subtle informational social influence. We start to conform to the rule that nobody ought to help. And this is not the only case of this. Back in the 60s, there are many cases of it is called the bystander effect. When there are many bystanders to a crime, it becomes incredibly unlikely for anyone to help, because everybody's looking to each other asking, should we do anything? Should we do anything? And the more no one does anything, the more we start to unconsciously think that doing nothing is the right thing to do. All right, so there's another video I want you to watch now, just to sort of demonstrate that this is not, I want you to sort of watch the bystander effect in progress. So go to this YouTube clip and watch it, and then come back and we'll discuss it. So that's really difficult to watch, right? The bystander effect is really tough to watch. But I don't want you to get the sense that people are bad. This does not make people bad people, right? People are responding to social norms, right? A socially driven normative behavior. They see other people and they think that's the right thing to do. Not helping is the right thing to do. Because the research is really clear that if one person sees somebody else in distress, they'll help. They're much more likely to help. For every extra person that watches an emergency happen, the likelihood of help actually occurring just goes down and down and down and down and down. And it's not because people are bad. It's because people are looking to other people as good sources of information, right? So I want you to imagine yourself, right? On slide 13, I want you to imagine yourself, and you see a child walking on the tracks of the Metrolink near campus. And you think to yourself, well, this is an emergency. I would definitely help. Well, that depends. It really depends. It depends on how clear this is an emergency, right? If it's a 12-year-old walking on the tracks, that's a little ambiguous. That's a little unclear. If it's a 2-year-old walking on the tracks, that is clearly an emergency, and probably everyone is going to intervene, right? You're not going to see the bystander effect crop up, right? Ambiguity. The unclearness of most emergency situations, because most emergencies don't look obviously like emergencies, right? And so it's the ambiguity, it's the lack of clarity that often leads to the bystander effect, right? Because if it's a 12-year-old on the effect, a 12-year-old on the tracks, here are the steps to helping. Well, you have to notice that the event happens, and then you have to interpret it as an emergency. And if other people don't help, then you may not actually interpret it as an emergency, right? And and if you don't even see it as an emergency because nobody else is helping, you have no hope of intervening, right? Because even if you interpret it as an emergency, you may not actually help, right? You may be scared, you may not think it's your job to help, but definitely, if you don't even see it as an emergency because no one else is helping, well, you're definitely not going to intervene, and someone could end up dead. Right, so moving on to slide 14. keep in mind that a child on the tracks is sometimes an ambiguous situation, right? And if no one else is helping, then people take that as information. The fact that no one else is helping becomes subtle, unconscious signal for you to not help. And this is called pluralistic ignorance. No one is as stupid as all of us, right? No one person is as stupid as all of us can be collectively together. Pluralistic ignorance. We are ignorant together because we're all thinking that everyone else is deciding not to help. And in reality, we're all looking to each other and collectively deciding not to help. And the bystander effect simply is, the more people who watch something happen, the less likely it is that anyone will help. All right, so now, so this is informational social influence, right? Can be good sometimes, can be bad sometimes, right? It's good when it prevents us from not stepping out in front of a bus, but also here's another example of informational social influence that's not bad. Let's say you're driving to a sporting event and you know how to get to the Coliseum, you know how to get to the Honda Center, but you don't actually know where to park, right? And so you get to the sporting venue, and you're like, well, where do we park? And you suddenly see a long row of cars. Everyone is turning left at the light. You're like, I bet that is where we should go to park, right? That is informational social influence, and it's not bad. Where it can be bad is in these helping situations, right? These bystander effect situations, and get in the way of making a good critical thinking based decision. But not all social influence is informational. Sometimes we conform. Sometimes we conform because we believe that simply because we don't want to look different. We know that what the other people are doing is wrong. We know that what the other people believe is wrong, but we conform to their point of view to simply not look like the odd man out. And that is called normative social influence. And I want you to watch a sort of a short video that illustrates normative social influence as well. So go ahead and watch this clip and then come back and we'll talk about it. All right, so is this informational social influence? Do these people who look at these lines actually believe that their eyes are deceiving them? And the overwhelming amount of evidence is that no, most of the participants do not convince themselves that they're having faulty eyes. Most of the participants, upon follow-up, explain that they just didn't want to feel weird, right? So let's look at slide 16. Just make it really clear that there was no ambiguity here. There was no lack of clarity in this situation, right? The line on the left, which one is it? Front, middle, or last? It's the middle line. It's obviously the middle line. No one is confused about what the right answer is. And yet, people cave. They cave. They may give the right answer at first when every single other person gives the wrong answer. They may go, what's wrong with these people? And give the right answer. But then on the third time, and then the fourth time, it just gets incredibly difficult. It starts to become psychologically painful. There's actually these fascinating research studies that look at how nonconformity, and when we look at sort of fMRI research, so brain activation research, when people don't conform, it's the part of your brain that actually regulates strong, painful responses lights up like a Christmas tree, right? We actually experience rejection. We experience lack of conformity as sort of painful. And so it's hard. It's hard being the odd man out. And in these studies, it's something about the unanimous nature of the group, right? The public conformity happens when everyone else is doing something, because when they did follow-up studies, when even one other person gave the right answer, conformity dramatically decreased. So it's something about the unanimous nature of the majority influence that can lead to this clear case of public conformity, public acquiescence. You're not actually convinced it's the right thing to do. You're just caving. You're just caving to the pressure of the group. And this is called normative social influence. Normative social influence, where you're just conforming in order to look normal. And on slide 17, I just sort of point out like the mechanics of this true experiment that was done in 1956 by Solomon Asch. When participants were alone, that's the control condition, right? They also did a condition where participants wrote down their answers on a piece of paper, as opposed to have to publicly calling out their answers. And this was very similar to the control condition. But in the experimental condition, participants guessed the line in groups. There were 7 Confederates, and then in the first 6 trials, everyone gave the right answer. But then on the last 12 trials, because they were shown 18 different lines, in the 12 of the trials, everyone started giving the wrong answer. And I mean, everyone started giving the wrong answer. And so then what did people do? Did they give the wrong answer? And slide 18, they absolutely did, right? Almost everyone caved. And what you're seeing here is that in a group, people start giving the right answer, but then about halfway through, almost everyone starts caving. And by the end, everyone is giving the wrong answer that everyone else is. So it just really shows you sort of the power of majority influence. But then on slide 19, I want to show you that if even one other person gives the right answer, if they dissent, if they're a lone voice of dissent among those Confederates, right? And again, these people are trained to give the wrong answer, right? They're trained to give the wrong answer. If even one other person is trained to give the right answer, then the one real participant, the one real test subject, then also gives the right answer. Those accuracy rates pop right back up to 100% or darn close, right? It's something, so then this person is then can be informationally influenced by the one person giving the right answer, instead of being normatively socially influenced by this unanimous group all giving the right answer. The wrong answer, rather. So what's happening here is people don't want to be the only one who are different. Even if the whole group is given is nonsense, even if the whole group is giving the wrong answer, even if the whole group is just reporting nonsense, nobody wants to be that one person. Nobody wants to be that one person sticking out and seeming different. It just becomes too hard. Becomes too hard. So this is called normative social influence because it's not about getting good information from other people. Nobody actually thinks that the line is the right line. They just want to look normal, right? They want to just have their behavior match that of other people because they don't want other people to judge them, right? They don't actually think it's the right thing to do. They're just going along to get along. Going along to get along. And this isn't always bad, right? This isn't always bad, because sometimes being a nonconformist, going against the group, does have negative interpersonal consequences, right? Somebody's going to vote you off the island if you don't conform. And so this isn't always the inappropriate thing to do. It just sometimes can be, right? And you could argue that it sucks that anyone should ever have to engage in normative social influence. But that's life, man, right? That's life. The idea that if you are the only one who sticks out, people might judge you harshly is life, right? And so oftentimes people will go along to get along, engage in normative social influence, even though they know what they're doing isn't the right thing to do, because that's what's adaptive. And it only becomes, truly horrific when maybe you end up in situations where what other people are doing is harmful, right? What other people are doing is dangerous. What other people are doing is illegal or immoral, right? Because those same pressures to go along with what everyone else is doing are there no matter what. we have this basic evolutionarily driven tendency to go along because, well, there are consequences when people defy the group, even if what the group is doing is not the right decision, right? And so a good critical thinker weighs those consequences carefully. A good critical thinker thinks to themselves, I'm feeling this pressure to go along. I'm feeling this pressure to go along. Should I? Is this the right thing to do? Am I going to let my values guide me? Am I going to let my morals guide me? Am I going to go along to get along in this situation because really it's not that big a deal? Like, let's say you're in a work group and everyone's deciding whether or not you should go with Arial versus Verdana font, and you actually know that the research says that Arial font is actually better and it's more readable, and you're actually right in your head. You know you're right, but everyone else wants Verdana, and before you can get a word in edgewise, everyone has said it's got to be Verdana, and you're thinking to yourself, well, this is not that big a deal. Right? I do not want to be the only person advocating for Arial, even though Arial really is the best font. Research on dyslexia, things like that, right? But you go along to get along, right? And then in that situation, that might actually be the right thing to do, because who wants to have an argument over fonts, right? And if everyone else is so on board with the Verdana, then who cares? Go along to get along. Normative social influence. But if you're in a situation where what everyone wants to do is harmful, like think about back in high school. Let's say everyone is picking on somebody, everyone is harassing somebody, and you're the only, in your mind you're saying this is the wrong thing to do. Now if I stand up for this person, I may in fact get ridiculed myself, but I'm going to push back against this normative social influence because I'm being driven by my values, being driven by my morals. A good critical thinker actively and consciously makes this decision and doesn't just cave to the pressure of normative social influence, decides explicitly to make good decisions based on a conscious, explicit thought process. And I just want to briefly go over the research that suggests that normative social influence is sometimes adaptive. It's sometimes the right, I don't know if you would say it's the right thing to do morally, but it's certainly the adaptive response. Right? There's a huge deal of research that shows that people who are nonconformists, in fact, have their brains respond as if they're in pain. It's part of the brain called the amygdala, right? It lights up like a Christmas tree when people are rejected or when they don't conform to the group. And so just keep that in mind, that being a nonconformist is difficult. Pushing back against a group that you know to be wrong is hard. Our brains have a tendency, we have an evolved tendency to go along with the group. But a good critical thinker harnesses the power of their prefrontal cortex, harnesses the power of their critical thinking to make good decisions. Moving on to slide 22, I just want to share with you the research that makes it very clear. Nonconformists who push back against the group, particularly a unanimous group, often risk getting rejected, which hurts, right? It's salient. So here was this study where that done back in the late 70s, where they had a bunch of real participants come in and take part in a discussion group about juvenile delinquency, and they were all given this case about this guy named Johnny Rocco, which is such a precious name, right? In any case, and these participants were reading over this case, and they were asked to give their recommendations about what the school should do about Johnny Rocco in terms of, should he be kicked out? Should he be suspended? What should we do about Johnny, right? And there was one Confederate. So this was the one person who was in on it. Everyone else were the real participants, right? Everyone else was a real participant. But there was then one Confederate who was trained to either conform. So you had a bunch of discussion groups where this person conformed and just went along with whatever the group said. a second group, but in a second condition, there were a bunch of groups where this person started out with his own point of view, but then eventually conformed to what everyone else thought. So you have sort of two groups now. Groups where this person is conforming, and then groups where this person is starting out disagreeing, but then conforms. But then in a third set of discussions, this person has his own point of view throughout the discussion, sticks to his guns, disagrees with the group respectfully. This person was trained to be respectful about it, but they just said, no, I just really disagree with you guys. I think X, Y, and Z should happen. And so the question then became, who was voted off the island? Because the researchers then asked all of the discussion groups to choose one person to leave to vote because the groups were too big. Who do you think got kicked out? Who did they vote off the island? Yeah, they voted the person off the island who was constantly disagreeing. Even though they were trained to disagree respectfully, the person with a divergent viewpoint kicked out of the group, right? So people engage in normative social influence. People cave to social pressure because it's adaptive. But a good critical thinker recognizes when you shouldn't do that, right? When there's serious consequences on the line. Right, so conformity. So to wrap our heads around conformity. Informational social influence, normative social influence, neither is necessarily a bad thing, right? It just can be. And so a good critical thinker recognizes when conformity pressures are pushing against them, right? Compliance, on the other hand, is a special type of social influence where our beliefs or our behaviors do because of the direct intentional influence of others. And that's the difference. So what is compliance? Right? It's when someone else is trying to get us to change, and then we do. Because conformity happens whether other people notice we're trying to conform or not, right? Compliance, on the other hand, is when someone is intentionally trying to get us to change. Direct, intentional influence from others. And that's the difference. It's about intention. Compliance is when we change because of another person's intention. So there's just not time to cover all of the different aspects of compliance. But I do want to just share with you some of the big research on the weapons of compliance. And if you're interested, moving on to slide 24, it's really a man named Cialdini, who is the sort of the lion in social psychology about how compliance affects our thinking. It really taps into some automatic tendencies we have to conform, automatic tendencies we have, and to sort of get us to go along. And so we're going to only focus on the weapons of compliance. We're only going to focus on sort of the how compliance can portray us in these social, in sort of sales situations. Compliance can happen in every aspect of life, but we're going to focus on sort of these sort of real world examples of compliance. So we're going to go over several weapons of compliance as discussed by a man named Cialdini, and how basic psychological tendencies where we're automatically responding can lead us to sort of give in to what other people want us to do. And so the first is called reciprocity, or is reciprocity. Our desire to repay other people who do nice things for us. It's called reciprocity. And it's this idea that people like to balance the scales, to reciprocate, reciprocity. And it's been demonstrated as powerful and pervasive. That means no matter which cultures we go to, we see people liking to balance the scales, right? To make sure that they're not in debt to other people is the idea. And so here was a study done in the 70s that demonstrated compliance, how people are more likely to comply because of their desire to balance the scales, reciprocity. This was a study that was supposed to be on art appreciation. So people showed up to the study and they were paired off by the researcher. And one of the participants was real and the other participant was a Confederate again. And they varied two different things. There were two independent variables. The fake participant, called the Confederate, was either trained to be super nice or super mean. And then the Confederate, the fake participant, either gave the person they were walking around with a soda pop, a Coke, or they gave him no Coke. They just didn't offer anything. And so you've got four different situations: a nice person who gives you a Coke, a nice person who doesn't give you a Coke, a mean person who gives you a Coke, and a mean person who doesn't give you a Coke. And then what they found was that in this situation, being likable didn't matter very much. Only thing that seemed to matter for compliance was whether or not the person gave them a soda pop. Because what they then asked them to do, the dependent variable, was the number of raffle tickets the real participant bought from the fake participant, right? So they're walking around looking at art all day, and it basically, if the person offers you a Coke, it doesn't matter if that person is nice to you or not. If the person offers you a Coke, you are going to buy more raffle tickets for them. In fact, if the person buys you a Coke, you're going to buy as many raffle tickets as if a nice person buys you a Coke. Now, the likable people did have more raffle tickets purchased for them, but the likable people who did, and now the mean people who didn't share the raffle tickets, nobody bought tickets from them. Big fat goose egg, zero. The likable people had a few people buy raffle tickets for them, but the likable people who didn't offer the Coke. But among people who offered the Coke, liking didn't matter. If the person bought you a Coke, whether or not you were agreeable for the rest of the day didn't matter. You bought just as many raffle tickets, theoretically, to balance the scales. In fact, it's been theorized that an unlikable person who does something nice for you, you're especially likely to do something nice back for them, so you're not in debt to this jerk. Does that make sense? Reciprocity. Another weapon of compliance, another example of reciprocity that can be used in sales is called the door in the face technique. And this is where this works off reciprocity because it turns out that saying no to somebody feels crappy. We don't like to have to say no to people. Don't believe me? Think about the last time someone texted you asking you for a favor. What did you do? Did you come right out and say no? Or did you just ignore their message till the next day where you said, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get your text message till this morning. Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't, right? When in reality you did see their text message, you just didn't want to have to say no, right? Yeah, we don't like to say no to people. It feels yucky. And in fact, when we do have to say no to people, we end up feeling this subtle sense of obligation that we want to then sort of pay them back for having said no. There's this great commercial from the 90s where there are these kids saying, hey, Mom, can I buy a flamethrower? Hey, Mom, can I go to the moon? Hey, Mom, can I send my sister to Abu Dhabi? And the mom's having to say, no, 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 no. But then they're saying, hey, Mom, can we go to McDonald's? And she's like, yes, we can go to McDonald's. And this may be reciprocity at work. If you have to say no a whole bunch, it's like you want to say yes to balance the scales, to sort of give back to this person because you had to say no. And it's called the door in the face technique because it's like you get the person to slam the door in your face because then they feel bad. And then they're more likely to open the door for you the next time. And it can be used in sales, right? And this is, think about the idea that like a salesman might say, oh, do you want to buy this $100,000 car? And you're like, no, I cannot buy a $100,000 car. And they're like, oh, well, how about this $2 keychain? And you're like, oh, yeah, sure, I'll buy a $2 keychain. right? Door in the face technique. And here's another study that sort of looked at this. They recruited people who signed up that they were interested in working as a volunteer. They said, anyone interested in possibly being involved in a youth counseling program, come to this informational session, right? And what they then did is they split them up into two groups, right? It was a true experiment. And in the first group, they said, hey, now that you've heard about this counseling program, how many of you would like to counsel a young person at an upcoming zoo trip for 2 hours? And about 17% of the people agreed, right? They're like, okay, I've been to the informational session, and now I hear they want me to supervise and counsel someone for 2 hours next week at the zoo. 17% of the people said, yeah, sign me up. That was one group of people. Call it the control condition. But the next group of people, the second group of people, they initially asked them after the informational session, can you agree to supervise young people 2 hours a week for the next year? Nobody agreed, right? Nobody after an informational session are going to say, yeah, sign me up every week for the next 2 years. That's just not something anyone agreed to. But then they followed that up with the same request they gave the other people. Oh, well, will you be willing to just next week supervise for 2 hours? Now, suddenly, 50% of these folks are going, oh, yes, I will, in fact, do it for 2 hours next week. So a 17% base rate agreement jumped to 50% because of this door in the face technique. Having to say no to the unreasonable request, the completely unreasonable request, made them more likely to say yes to a more reasonable request. Door in the face technique works off reciprocity. Moving on to slide 27. Another weapon of compliance is cognitive dissonance itself. Cognitive dissonance itself, our desire for consistency, a desire to feel like we're consistent, that we meet our commitments, the desire to feel like consistent people, right? Working off our cognitive dissonance, right? And so this is called the foot in the door technique. It's like the opposite of the door in the face technique, right? It's where you make a teeny tiny request that almost everyone would say yes to, a teeny tiny request that everyone would say yes to, and then ask a little harder request, and then a little more, and then another request, and then another request, and then another request, and then another request, until the person is agreeing to some huge thing, right? And it doesn't even have to be a series of requests. Sometimes you can just ask someone for one thing that's small, and then follow it up with a larger, kind of unreasonable request, and if they'd said yes to the first thing, they become much more likely to say yes to the second thing, cognitive dissonance. And here is one of the first research studies to demonstrate this, done in the 60s by Friedman and Fraser. They had women who worked, women who were homemakers, women who were stayed at home, rate household products that they might be interested in using. Right? And so they essentially went door to door, and they said, hey, would you be willing to fill out a survey about our household products? And then they said, okay. And some of the women said, yes, I would be willing to rate household products, right? And then 3 days later, they were asked by the researchers to please let them inventory the products. And what they found was, if they had initially agreed to rate the household products, they were then over 50% more likely to say, yes, come in and inventory my entire pantry, spend all day here. Versus people where they just knocked on the door and said, hey, would you be willing to let me inventory your entire pantry? So like a control condition, where only 22% of people agreed. So saying yes to the survey first more than doubled the level of agreement among the women in the request to do something pretty unreasonable, which is inventory their entire pantry, right? So door in the foot in the door. Just get my foot in the door with a small request. I'm just gonna get my foot in the door with a small request, which makes you much more likely, because of cognitive dissonance, to say yes to the next request, because people like to feel consistent. And I always like to imagine, as I'm walking through the mall, there are these people who engage in sort of pretty heavy-handed sales tactics where all they want you to do is stop and talk to them, right? Foot in the door, right? They just want you to stop and talk to them for a minute. Just try our product. Just try our product for a minute, right? And then get that foot in the door. And then it becomes increasingly difficult over time for you to call it quits and say, okay, I'm done, I'm walking away. Cognitive dissonance. Foot in the door. All right, slide 28. Is another study that sort of demonstrated commitment and consistency. This is a part of that same study by Friedman and Fraser. They decided to go door to door and ask people to put a little 3-inch sign in their window saying, would you be a safe driver? And a 3-inch sign. Everybody said yes. Oh, sure, I'll put a 3-inch sign in my window, no problem. I can always take it down later, 3-inch sign, sure, right? And then 2 weeks later, they went and said, okay, now I want to put a large public service announcement billboard on your front lawn, right, that says drive carefully. And now this is a pretty unreasonable request, but what they found was people who they'd asked to put a 3-inch sign in their window first, over 76% of them said, sure, put a giant billboard on my lawn, versus the people who they just went to and asked without the 3-inch sign, the people that they just came to and said, hey, will you put a giant billboard on your lawn? Only 17% of these people were willing to do this, right? So it dramatically increased compliance when you asked the small request first. Right? And just think about how often this happens. Slide 29 in sales techniques, right? How this can actually be lowballing or bait and switching, are examples of cognitive dissonance being used against you as a weapon of compliance. If they can just get you in there, if they can get you in the door, then you're like walking down the path of buying a car. And even if they switch up the price on you later, or they say, oh no, suddenly your interest rate's going to be higher, it becomes very difficult for you to walk away because of cognitive dissonance, because of our desires to be committed and consistent in our choices and to feel like consistent people. Right, and so then the next weapon of compliance I want to go over is liking, right? And this is just the idea that we like people who like us, and we like people who remind us of ourselves, right? We're more likely to say yes to people who we like. Right? That just seems obvious. But there are so many things we like about people. We like people who share our same name. We like people who share our same profession. We like people who have the same political views as us. We like people who are beautiful, right? Physically attractive people are much more likely to be complied with than non-physically attractive people. And it's sort of this strange thing, right? More attractive defendants get lighter sentences. More attractive lawyers are more likely to get their clients off. We're more likely to say yes to people who are attractive because we tend to like people who are beautiful, right? But also people like ourselves, and also people who compliment us, right? Who try to ingratiate themselves with us, right? And that's what salespeople do. Salespeople try to get us to like them in an effort to get us to comply. And there is a particular type of sort of sales tactic I'd like to share with you. And it's the idea of the house party. And it comes in a lot of different varieties, right? There are jewelry parties, candle parties, makeup parties. There are even parties for men where they have like man cave parties, where essentially a friend of yours invites you over to their house to sell you stuff. And these parties work on multiple levels. These parties work on several weapons of compliance. They work off reciprocity, because often there's a free gift. They work on consistency. They work on commitment and consistency, where they actually get you to try on the product or use the product and then talk about how much you like it. Like, oh, like a Mary Kay party. You may go over for a makeover party at a friend's house, and then you're interacting with the makeup, and they're saying, oh, how do you like it? Do you feel pretty? And then you're like, oh yeah, I love this eyeshadow. And so then if you don't then buy the eyeshadow, you kind of feel like that yucky cognitive dissonance. Well, if I like the eyeshadow so much, why aren't I buying it, right? And then of course you're at the house of somebody who you like. It's just your friend. Now, is your friend a jerk? No, of course not. But make no mistake, the companies that use this sales technique of hosting parties are almost all, they know what's up. They know about these weapons of compliance, and they know that they work, and it's big business. It's big business. So if you ever get invited to one of these house parties, a jewelry party, a Mary Kay party, a Tupperware party, although they don't really have Tupperware parties anymore. That's really something in the 80s. But a candle party, a toy party, a man cave party where they want to sell you barbecue equipment. Keep in mind that it's going to be hard for you not to buy stuff from your friend. It's going to be hard because the sales techniques are such that you're going to feel the pressure to buy something the way you wouldn't in a store. And if you like the products, more power to you, right? If you know you like that jewelry, if you know you like those Jamberry nails, if you know you like the Mary Kay makeup, go. But recognize that it's going to be you're gonna buy stuff. You are where you might not have standing in a store, because these weapons of compliance are being used against you, not by your friend per se, but certainly by the company that your friend works for. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but a good critical thinker recognizes when they're being manipulated, right? All right, so the last weapon of compliance is scarcity, where someone points out to us that we can't do something, and this actually works off of our desire for personal autonomy, our desire to believe that we're autonomous individuals who make our own decisions. And when someone points out to us that we can't do something, well, that's all we ever want to do, right? If I can't see that movie, suddenly I definitely want to see it. If I can't read that book, suddenly I definitely want to read the book, right? And if you think about, there have been so many cases in the past where there was a hot toy at Christmas, and you found out parents found out they couldn't buy it for their kid. Now suddenly people are willing to spend thousands of dollars on a Tickle Me Elmo, whether or not that 3-year-old was ever going to care about the Tickle Me Elmo, right? But because you couldn't have it for your kid, you had to have it. Beanie Babies, Cabbage Patch Kids, so many toy examples where people are willing to spend thousands of dollars to get a toy, right? Because they think they can't have it. But also things like the Home Shopping Network, right? Where they say 12 more minutes, there's only 2 of these left. So you better buy the Diamond bracelet with the fake gold plating, and right, it works off scarcity. Or when you watch infomercials and they say you must call in the next 15 minutes in order to get this deal, and if you called in 2 days, I bet you could still get that same deal, right? Scarcity. Recently there was this movie called The Interview, starring Seth Rogen, and I had no interest in watching this movie at all. But then I found out that basically it wasn't going to come out in theaters because of some drama that happened with Sony and North Korea, and so Sony wasn't going to distribute the film. And so when it came on Netflix, I thought to myself, I'm going to watch it. Right, I'm going to watch this movie because they told me I couldn't watch it. I wonder what all this fuss is about. And so I watched it because someone told me that I couldn't. Scarcity, right? There was an example in the 90s in Dade County, Florida, where they were going to ban soaps containing phosphates. Now, soaps containing phosphates don't clean any better than than other types of soap, right? Like there are tons of soaps without phosphate. They clean just as well. But because people were told they couldn't buy soaps with phosphates anymore because they damage the environment, suddenly everyone had to have phosphate soap. Right? There were actually like soap caravans, people buying 20-year supplies of the phosphate soaps, right? Because they were told they couldn't have them, right? That's the idea. And so the last weapon of compliance is authority. And this is where we're going to stop our discussion because authority is a weapon of compliance in its own right. And when we comply with somebody who is an authority figure, because we have this basic, adaptive, evolutionarily driven tendency to obey authority figures. And it's not always a bad thing. It's not always a bad thing. And when we obey authority figures, that's a special type of compliance called obedience, which deserves a discussion in its own right. And so, see you next time, critical thinkers. Have a good one.